Hey, all you fans out there, I've had a lot of you request to get a little bit of information about how I got started in the monster truck world. So we're going to do some little episodes this year, kind of intermixed along with some of the other interviews and other episodes. Basically, how I got started was at a very young age. I was born in 1970. My mom says I came out with my motor running. My dad raced go-karts and went to the local drag strip and raced and stuff when I was still in her womb and before I was born, and even after I was born. He was always into automotive racing and cars, and had an auto repair body shop. He also worked at International Harvester, but on the weekends and on the evenings he worked on cars and built a lot of cool cars. As a little kid, I was always fascinated with anything with wheels and motors. And I used to tear apart my little toys and put bigger tires on them and stuff, even before monster trucks were ever heard of. Even in elementary school, I used to draw pictures of trucks, and they always had to have big tires on them. And we would go sometimes to the stone quarry to get gravel and things for our driveway. And back then, we would manually hand shovel it. But we would go to a stone quarry, and I would see a big payloader with big tires, and I used to tell my dad, just as a little kid, I'd say, "Dad, I want to put them tires on a truck someday." And he'd always laugh and say, "Oh, that would never work, son. That just wouldn't make any sense." So when Bigfoot came out on the 48s, I remember seeing that in the magazines. We were a subscriber to Four Wheel and Off-Road, and I remember telling Dad, I says, we see all those big sprayers with the bigger tires, which now we all know are 66s. Back then, we just knew they were big tires. And I told him back then, I said, we ought to put them on a truck someday. And, "Oh, that makes no sense, son. That'd be crazy." Well, then later on, everybody knows that's where it came in. But back in the early 80s, of course, my dad was always bringing home junk cars, fixing them up. He was big into hot rods, and I was always right there with him helping. Grew up riding on three-wheelers and lawnmowers, all kinds of stuff. This is a funny story. When I was about 4 years old, my dad would actually take me out in the yard with a little wagon on the back of our lawnmower, and my sister was 2 years younger, so she would be 2 years old in the wagon, and I couldn't reach the pedals or anything, but he would get the lawnmower going, and then he'd turn me loose, and that was entertainment for me and my sister for a couple hours at a time. He'd put it in gear and take off, and he'd go back to work, and I'd be out in the front yard just driving in circles and in figure eights and stuff, pulling my little sister around in the back in the little wagon. But anyways, in the early 80s, my dad and his real good friend Jerry Rathburn, who's the guy that taught me how to weld, they built what we know as the Cookie Monster. It was a four-wheel drive car. It was kind of Dad's dream to have a four-wheel drive that was a car and just something as a custom. And through the years, it evolved into different vehicles. But 84 was the first real taste of getting to see monster trucks up and close. We seen the ad for the Four Wheel and Off-Road Jamboree in Indianapolis, and we took the Cookie Monster down there to that show, and that was just, that was life-changing to me. A lot of you guys can relate to that. When you seen the monster trucks your first time, it was just fascinating. So going from there, that was in the early 80s, about 88, probably 89, 90, somewhere around there. I lose track of time because a lot of things progressed. I was actually building my first monster truck, or trying to. It was an old International Scout. We always had them growing up because my dad worked at Harvester. Later, early in the 80s, he lost his job at Harvester. They moved out of the Fort Wayne area. So he went into the body shop business full time, and just turned a hobby into a full-time business. But anyways, I was building what now is Shotgun Harry, everybody's familiar with. I was building that as kind of like my first monster truck. That was what I was going to have as my first monster truck, and I was trying to build it in high school. Had no money, but I was working on it. And we had a call from a guy named Kirk Dabney. This would have been in the late 80s, sometime around 90. I can't remember exactly what date. But he called my dad. He was hanging out at Scott Hess's shop and called and says, "Hey, I need some wheels painted for a truck. What would you charge to paint some wheels?" Well, Kirk was always a little ornery, and my dad thought he was talking regular pickup truck wheels, and he said, "Oh, $25 a piece." Well, Kirk says, "Well, I'll bring them right out." So he showed up with these 466-inch, tires with wheels, and my dad about fell over and said, I had no idea that's what we were talking about. But my dad held up to the price and did them for him. And the two of us kind of got to talking. I said, "Dad," I said, "why don't we sponsor him?" I was working for my dad full time in Cook's Body Shop. And I said, "Why don't we sponsor him? And I tell you what, I will work for free whenever it's anything at Kirk Dabney's, so that it won't cost you anything, and we'll get our name on that truck." And that'll be a pretty cool deal to be able to go to monster truck shows and see the name. So then I started actually going on the road with Dabney and helping crew and helped with a lot of the stuff. And this was right about the time when he was building the blue giant truck. And we did all the paint work on that. And most of his show trucks I was very heavily involved in through the years. And Cook's Body Shop was on almost all of them. And so that's kind of how I got my first start in the monster truck world. So in '91, Dabney bought the Nightmare truck off of Steve Hess. It was the second monster truck. They really didn't call it Nightmare 2 because the first monster truck was Nightmare 2. It gets a little confusing sometimes on the way he numbered them. But anyways, we changed that over to the Thunderstruck truck, and Kirk ran that in '91 and the early part of '92 in the Thunder Nationals series. And then in the spring, I had no idea, but he called my dad one time in the spring and said, "Hey, would you care if you lost Jeff as an employee? Because I would sure like to hire him." And of course, my dad knew that was a dream come true for me. So I actually went up to Canada and stayed up there for about a month and a half. And I don't even remember all the shows that we did, but I basically went up there and got put in a monster truck with no driving experience at all. And I remember Kirk telling me, he says, "Now, you got to do a really good job because I had to lie to get you this job." And I said, "What do you mean you lied?" He says, "Well," he said, "this promoter would never have hired you if he didn't know you never drove a monster truck before." And we were doing little hockey rinks all over the country of Canada. And so my first show out there, I had no idea what I was doing, but I was in a little tiny hockey rink that still had the hockey boards up, and there was so many people in that building, they were up against the glass looking at us. And I tell you, that was scary, but it made me have to drive good right off the get-go. And he told that promoter I'd been driving for years, but of course I was really young, so I don't know how that guy believed him. But Kirk basically set off to the side and would kind of give me some pointers. He said, "You back up and I'll tell you when to stop, and then you floor it when I tell you to, and you hit them cars." And really, I did very good for no experience, but I wanted to do it so bad that I was just, I was so excited about the opportunity. So I drove Thunderstruck all of the whole summer of '92 and into the fall. And then I actually got a phone call from Marty Garza in around, I think it was November. Him and Jerry Richmond had teamed up and was running the Overkill trucks. And Jerry, I think, called me first and asked if I would be interested in driving one of the Overkill trucks. And of course, I called Kirk, and he said, "Man," he goes, "that's a good opportunity. That'd be good for you to work for Marty." So we worked up a deal, and I went and did my first show up in Bangor, Maine. Had no idea what I was getting into. Thunderstruck, Kirk had took the big 540 out of it when he took the truck to Canada and put a stock 454 with a 4-barrel on it. And so that thing had maybe 400 horsepower if we was lucky. And so, that thing, I had to run it for all it was worth. I had to run it wide open all the time and take a hard charge at everything to get it to do anything. And so then I get into Overkill and had never drove it. Went to my first show, was in Bangor, Maine, and it was I think it was a gymnasium for school. It had retractable bleachers and just a really small floor. And of course, that thing had a big 514 in it with a blower and injector, and it had way more horsepower than what that truck should have had. And went out there, the first car I hit, I launched that baby and landed the tailgate into like the fourth car or something like that, and learned real quick that that thing had some power. Ran that basically that show in November, and then I got to run it the first quarter of '93 for Marty, and that was a great opportunity. It got me in with the Thunder Nationals and Aaron and Becky Paulburn and Bill Bader back at the time. And that was a great experience for me. And then in the spring of '93 is when Overkill got burned up in the fire at Jerry's shop. And so that's kind of the first start. And then that's when I got started with building the War Wagon. And we're going to use that for another episode. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this.